It was the kind of night when no one should have been on that road. Late winter snow and a wind cold enough to make a lonely ranch house feel like the last place on earth. But then came a knock. On Grace Whitaker's porch stood a frozen stranger, clutching 2 newborn German Shepherd puppies against his chest. She had no idea that letting him in would awaken old grief and lead them all toward a miracle only God could have written. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you believe every storm can hide a miracle, please subscribe and stay with us until the end. A late winter blizzard rolled across rural Montana, burying dirt roads, fence posts, and the lonely fields around Cedar Hollow beneath a white silence that seemed old enough to remember every sorrow. Grace Whitaker stood in the kitchen of her family's ranch house, listening to the storm claw at the walls as if some hungry thing had found the last warm place on earth. The house was too large for one woman and too full of memory for peace. It had been built by her father's hands, repaired by her mother's patience, and left to Grace like a kingdom made of weathered boards, unpaid bills, and ghosts that still knew which floorboards creaked after midnight. At 32, Grace had the lean strength of someone who had learned not to wait for rescue. She was neither tall nor delicate, but there was a quiet toughness in the way she moved, a steadiness earned from hauling feed sacks through mud, mending wire in sleet, and waking before dawn even when grief had kept her awake all night. Her chestnut-brown hair was tied in a loose braid over one shoulder, strands escaping around a face made softer by kindness and sharper by survival. Her skin was fair from winter, her brown eyes watchful, warm when she allowed them to be, guarded when the world came too close. Most people in Cedar Hollow called her stubborn. Grace preferred the word standing. Stubborn was what folks called a woman when she refused to fall where they expected her to. The power had flickered twice already. Behind the house, the small generator coughed and hummed under a sheet of snow, feeding just enough light to keep the kitchen from sinking into darkness. The phone on the counter showed one thin bar of service, then none, then one again, like a tired signal trying to remember its duty. Grace checked it out of habit, though she knew better than to trust technology on a night like this. Out here, 12 miles from town and 3 miles from the nearest paved road, the modern world arrived late and left early. The wind was more reliable. So was silence. She had spent the evening bringing in firewood, checking the pump house and fastening a tarp over the old horse shed where the roof had begun to complain. Now, with the kettle cooling on the stove and the last lamp glowing on the table, she was ready to climb the stairs and pretend sleep would come. Then came the pounding. 3 hard blows struck the front door, not a neighbor's knock, not the soft courtesy of someone who expected welcome. This was desperate, heavy, uneven, a sound made by a hand that had run out of choices. Grace froze. The wind swallowed the echo, then threw it back against the house. Her first thought was not kindness. It was danger. No one came this far in a blizzard unless trouble had carried them. Her father's old words rose in her mind, stern and practical. Mercy is holy, Gracie, but lock the door first. Her father, Thomas Whitaker, had been a broad-shouldered rancher with sun-dark skin, a beard like iron filings, and a voice that could quiet a room without rising. He had been dead 3 years, but his caution still lived in the corners of the house. Grace reached behind the mudroom coats and took down his 12-gauge shotgun. Its weight was familiar, cold, and unwelcome. The pounding came again. "Ma'am," a man's voice called through the storm, roughened by cold. "Please, I don't mean harm. I need help." Grace moved toward the door, every nerve awake. Snow hissed against the windows. She thumbed the safety off, then stopped with her hand on the bolt. A foolish woman opened doors because she felt sorry. A cruel woman left strangers to die. Grace had spent years trying to be neither. She opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. The storm lunged in first, flinging snow across the floorboards. Beyond it stood a man shaped out of darkness and ice. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and controlled stance of someone whose body had once been trained to endure pain without asking permission. His military-style parka was coated white, the collar stiff with frozen breath. Beneath a dark knit cap, short brown hair showed at the edges, wet with melting snow. His face was angular and exhausted, with a strong jaw roughened by several days of beard, a straight nose reddened by cold, and gray-blue eyes that looked too calm for the storm around him. That calm frightened Grace more than panic would have. It was the kind of calm men carried back from places where fear had become useless. He looked about 39, maybe older in the eyes, younger in the way he held his pain like something he still expected to outrun. "My name is Noah Hayes," he said, his voice low and strained. "Former Navy SEAL. My truck slid off the road about a mile back. I found them near the ditch." He shifted the bundle against his chest, and only then did Grace see the soaked wool blanket pressed beneath his arms. Their mother didn't make it. A faint cry came from inside the blanket. It was a small sound, hardly more than a thread of breath, but it passed through Grace with such force that the shotgun lowered before she decided to lower it. She unhooked the chain and opened the door wider. "Show me." Noah pulled back one edge of the blanket. Inside were two newborn German Shepherd puppies, so young their eyes were still sealed against the world. One was black and tan, its tiny muzzle dark, its paws trembling as if the cold had reached its bones. The other was pale cream with faint gray along its back, smaller, weaker, its little mouth opening and closing without sound. They could not have been more than a few days old. Their fur was damp. Their bodies were too still between shivers. Grace had seen death come for calves, foals, lambs, barn cats, and once for her own mother in a hospital bed under lights too white to be kind. She knew the look of life standing at the edge. "Inside," she said. Noah hesitated only long enough to blink snow from his lashes. Grace stepped back, keeping the shotgun in one hand and pointing with the other. "Now." He came in carefully, as though afraid his boots might break the warmth. Snow slid from him onto the rug. He stood dripping in the entryway, large and uncertain, while Grace shut the door against the storm and threw the bolt. The house seemed to inhale around them. She took the blanket from him, surprised by how gently he surrendered it. His hands were big, scarred across the knuckles, but they trembled as the weight left them. Not from fear, she thought, from cold, from having held on too long. "Kitchen," she said. "By the stove." Grace laid the puppies on a folded towel near the wood stove, close enough for heat, but not too close to burn. The black and tan pup twitched. The pale one barely moved. Grace stripped off the wet blanket and began rubbing them with a dry towel, brisk but careful, muttering under her breath the way her mother used to when saving something small from the stupidity of weather. "Come on, little ones. Don't you dare quit before I've had the chance to boss you around." Noah gave the faintest sound then, almost a laugh, but it broke before it became one. He stayed near the doorway, swaying slightly. Grace glanced up. "Sit down before you fall down." "I'm fine." "You're lying badly." He obeyed, lowering himself onto a chair with the rigid caution of a man whose body had been ignoring pain for hours. Up close, Grace saw the torn sleeve of his parka, the mud frozen along his boots, the fine tremor in his jaw. He watched the puppies with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. Not ownership, not sentiment, responsibility. It was in every line of him, this haunted refusal to let another helpless thing die. Grace reached for her phone and held it toward the window, searching for a signal. One bar flickered. She called Dr. Helen Voss, Cedar Hollow's only veterinarian, a practical woman in her 50s with silver hair, square glasses, and the kind of voice that could calm both panicked ranchers and injured horses. The call cracked twice before connecting to voicemail. Grace left a message fast. Newborn pups, hypothermia, possible orphaned litter, storm conditions, call back if service allowed. Then she dug through the pantry cabinet where she kept animal supplies and found an unopened can of puppy milk replacer left from a stray litter last spring. For once, hoarding had proved wiser than cleaning. Noah watched her mix the formula with warm water. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. Grace tested the milk on her wrist. "The light brought you." His eyes shifted toward the lamp on the table. "I saw it through the snow, thought I imagined it." Most good things look imaginary in weather like this. He looked at her then, really looked, and Grace felt the weight of it. Not romantic, not yet, but human. Two tired souls standing on opposite shores of the same frozen river. She turned away first because kindness was easier when not stared at directly. They fed the puppies with a small dropper, one careful mouthful at a time. The black and tan pup fought weakly, swallowing after several tries. The pale one worried Grace. It refused the milk, its body limp in her palm. Noah leaned forward, his breath held. "Come on," he whispered, and there was something in his voice that made Grace's chest ache. It was not the voice of a stranger speaking to a dog. It was a man bargaining with the dark. Outside, the blizzard raged over Montana, swallowing roads, fences, and whatever remained of the night. Inside, the old ranch house gathered around the stove, around Grace's steady hands, around Noah's silent vigil, around two lives no bigger than mittens. Hours passed in small acts, warming towels, checking breaths, feeding drops of milk, rubbing tiny paws, listening for the generator, listening harder for the puppies. Grace forgot to be afraid of Noah. Noah forgot for moments at a time to look like a man being hunted by memory. Near dawn, the pale puppy stirred. It was barely anything, a small flex of one paw, a shiver that turned into breath, but Grace felt it like thunder. Noah saw it too. His face changed not into joy, exactly, but into something older and more fragile, like a door inside him had opened and found light on the other side. Grace cupped the puppy closer, warmth gathering beneath her fingers. The black and tan pup nudged against its sibling, both of them alive, both of them still fighting. Grace looked toward the windows. The storm had not ended. The road was still buried. The world beyond the ranch remained white, cold, and uncertain. But inside the kitchen beside the stove, the house no longer felt empty. It held a stranger, two newborn dogs, and a woman who had opened the door even while holding a gun. It held breath. It held risk. It held the first small mercy of a story not yet ready to die. For the first time in years, Grace Whitaker listened to the old house around her and thought it sounded less like a tomb than a heart beginning, painfully, to beat again. Morning did not arrive so much as pale through the storm, turning the windows of Whitaker Ranch from black mirrors into squares of trembling gray. The blizzard still moved across the Montana fields with the stubbornness of an old curse, flattening the grass beneath snow, burying the porch steps Grace had cleared only yesterday, and sealing the road to Cedar Hollow under drifts tall enough to swallow a truck's tires. Inside the kitchen, the wood stove burned low and steady, casting an amber glow over the towels spread near its iron belly. Grace Whitaker had not slept. Her chestnut braid had loosened into tangled waves around her face, and shadows sat beneath her brown eyes, but her hands remained careful, practical, alive with purpose. She had always believed exhaustion was something a person could negotiate with, like a stubborn mule or an overdue bill. Grief had taught her that much. Now she sat cross-legged on the worn braided rug, holding the darker puppy in one palm while coaxing warm formula into its mouth with a small rubber-tipped syringe. The tiny German shepherd was black and tan, no bigger than a rolled sock, with a dark muzzle, folded ears, and a fragile body that trembled even in the heat. Yet whenever Grace touched its chest, it seemed to gather some absurd little dignity and lift its head as if appointed guardian of the kingdom. "You've got a serious face for someone who can't see yet," Grace murmured, like a sheriff made of bread dough. Across from her, Noah Hayes sat with his back against the cabinet, the pale puppy wrapped against his chest beneath a dry towel. He had taken off the ice-stiff parka, revealing a dark thermal shirt stretched over a strong, battered frame. Without the storm around him, he looked less like an apparition and more like a man made of discipline and old wounds, square jaw darkened by stubble, cheekbones sharp from travel, shoulders broad but heavy with fatigue. His gray-blue eyes rarely left the puppy in his hands. The pale one was smaller, cream gray along the spine with a soft blonde face and paws the color of weak sunlight. It made almost no sound. That worried Grace more than crying would have. Crying meant fight. Silence, in newborn things, could be a door closing. The phone finally rang just after 8, startling both of them. Grace snatched it from the counter before the signal could vanish. "Grace?" came the voice through static. Dr. Helen Voss sounded as if she were speaking from the bottom of a tin well. Helen was Cedar Hollow's only veterinarian, a 56-year-old woman with silver hair usually twisted into a messy knot, square glasses forever sliding down her nose, and a temperament so calm that injured horses seemed embarrassed to panic in front of her. She had delivered calves in lightning storms, stitched ranch dogs on kitchen tables, and once argued a bull into backing out of a feed shed by calling him "Sir" in a tone that allowed no rebellion. "Tell me exactly what you have." Grace did. Newborn German shepherds, likely under a week old. Mother dead after a roadside accident. Exposure, possible hypothermia. Weak suckling. No way into town until the plow came through. Helen listened without wasting breath. "Keep them warm, but not hot. Feed every 2 to 3 hours, small amounts. Don't flood their lungs. Rub their lower bellies and backsides with a warm damp cloth after feeding. They can't manage that alone yet. If one goes limp or cold, skin-to-skin warmth. And Grace?" The static crackled like ice breaking. "Don't blame yourself if they don't make it. This is a hard start." Grace looked at Noah, at the way his hand covered the pale puppy like a roof against the world. "They've already had hard enough," she said. "We'll do the rest." The call died before Helen could answer. For the next several hours, the kitchen became a small, stubborn hospital. Grace warmed bottles of water and wrapped them in flour sack towels, building a nest inside an old wooden apple crate lined with quilts her mother had sewn from faded work shirts. Noah cleaned the syringe, measured formula, and wrote times in a small battered notebook he carried in his pocket. He wrote with the precise neatness of a man who trusted records when memory became dangerous. 8:20, dark pup, swallowed well. 8:35, pale pup weak, 3 drops only. 10:47, both warm. 11:05, dark pup urinated after stimulation. Grace noticed the handwriting, the habit, the silence around it. "You always keep notes like that?" she asked. Noah did not look up. "When things matter." She let the answer rest. By noon, the wind knocked a branch against the roof hard enough to make the lamps tremble. Noah rose at once, body moving before thought, one hand reaching toward a weapon he no longer carried. The reaction lasted only a second, but Grace saw it. He saw that she saw it. For a moment, shame passed across his face, quick and bitter. "Sorry," he said. "Old wiring." Grace checked the stove instead of staring. "This house jumps at branches, too. Don't apologize to old wiring, it only hums louder." Something near a smile touched his mouth, then vanished. Later, when the darker puppy pushed blindly against his sibling and gave a squeaking protest, Grace laughed softly. It startled her. The sound felt rusty, as though pulled from a drawer she had not opened since her mother died. "That one needs a name before he starts charging rent," she said. Noah looked at the pup, who had managed to wedge his tiny head over the edge of the towel like a watchman at a fortress wall. "Ranger," he said. Grace glanced up. "Because he keeps watch?" Noah nodded. "Because he thinks he does." The name settled instantly, as if the little creature had been waiting for it. Grace touched the pale puppy's head. "Then this one is Blue." Noah's brow softened. "Why Blue?" "Because this morning, when the snowlight came through the window, his fur looked almost blue at the edges. And because he needs a color that sounds like sky, he's had enough ditch and storm." Noah repeated it quietly. "Ranger and Blue." For the first time since arriving, he said something as if he expected it to exist tomorrow. Afternoon dragged into evening. The plow never came. Noah insisted on checking his truck once the wind eased, but Grace refused to let him go alone. They bundled up and fought their way down the lane with a flashlight, the snow knee-deep in places. His pickup sat half-buried near the ditch, front end angled against a cottonwood, one tire torn, the bumper bent, the hood crumpled enough to explain why it had died. Grace shone the light over it, lips pressed thin. You weren't driving out of here even if the road was clear. Noah looked at the truck, then back toward the faint gold of the ranch house. Guess I'm more trouble than I planned. Most trouble is. She turned before he could apologize again. You can stay in the mudroom tonight. After that, we'll talk. You can pay your rent by shoveling snow and fixing whatever the storm broke. Yes, ma'am. Don't ma'am me unless you want the broken pump added to the list. This time he did smile, small but real, and for one breath the storm seemed less proud of itself. That night, Blue worsened. It happened just after the 1:30 feeding. Ranger swallowed greedily, then curled into the towel with the grave satisfaction of a tiny king after supper. Blue refused the syringe. His mouth opened weakly, then stopped. His body cooled with terrifying speed, the softness of him turning slack in Grace's hands. She felt her throat close. No, she whispered, though she did not know whether she was speaking to the puppy, to God, or to every loss that had ever walked into her house without asking permission. Noah took Blue carefully, tucking the tiny body beneath his shirt against his chest, skin to fur, heartbeat to heartbeat. His face went still in a way that frightened Grace more than anger would have. He stared at the stove, but she knew he was seeing somewhere else. Sand instead of snow, smoke instead of wood fire, a young man under his command slipping away while Noah's hands failed to hold him in the world. Stay, he whispered, so low Grace almost missed it. Not again. Stay. Grace knelt beside him, warming a towel, rubbing Blue's paws between her fingers. She did not tell Noah it would be all right. Lies were cheap comfort. Instead, she kept working. Drop by drop, breath by breath. The generator hummed. The storm pressed against the house. Ranger slept on, unaware that his brother stood at the narrow gate between here and gone. Near dawn, Blue's paw twitched against Noah's wrist. Then came a breath, small but deeper than before. Another followed. Grace bowed her head, laughing once through tears she had not given herself permission to shed. Noah closed his eyes, and the hard lines of his face broke open into something raw and almost childlike. He did not cry, but he looked like a man who had remembered the shape of hope and did not know whether to trust it yet. By morning, Blue was still weak, but warm. Ranger nosed him irritably, as if offended by all the attention. Grace tucked them both into the quilt-lined crate and sat back against the cabinet beside Noah. Neither of them had slept, and neither spoke for a long while. Outside, the storm had softened but not ended. The road remained buried. The world remained uncertain. Yet beside the stove, 2 newborn puppies breathed in uneven rhythm, and 2 wounded strangers listened as if those tiny breaths were instructions. Grace understood then that saving them would not be a single act of mercy. It would be hours, days, maybe weeks of choosing not to give up. Noah seemed to understand it too. His hand rested near the crate, not touching, only guarding. In the pale Montana morning, with snow still covering every road away from the ranch, Grace realized that the night had not brought a visitor to her door. It had brought a beginning. By the 3rd week after the storm, the snow around Whitaker Ranch began to loosen its grip, melting in dirty ribbons along the fence lines and dripping from the barn roof like the slow ticking of an old clock. The fields were still mostly white, but here and there the earth showed through, dark and stubborn, as if Montana itself had decided it was tired of being buried. Noah Hayes had not left. At first it had been because the road was blocked, then because his truck needed parts from Billings, then because the ranch had a list of broken things long enough to humble a saint and annoy a devil. Grace Whittaker did not ask him to stay, and he did not ask permission each morning before working. He simply rose before sunrise, made coffee strong enough to frighten a preacher, and stepped outside with a shovel, hammer, or roll of wire in hand. He replaced the rotten boards on the front porch, pulled a sagging fence straight near the lower pasture, thawed and rewrapped the exposed water line behind the pump house, and patched the horse shed roof with the quiet accuracy of a man who trusted labor more than speech. Grace watched him sometimes from the kitchen window, pretending to rinse a cup that had been clean for 5 minutes. There was nothing soft about him from a distance. Broad shoulders beneath a faded work jacket, dark stubble along his jaw, boots planted like he expected the ground to argue, but whenever Ranger and Blue were near, something in him unfastened. The 2 German shepherd pups had grown from trembling scraps of life into clumsy little tyrants with round bellies and oversized paws. Ranger, the black and tan male, had opened his eyes first, dark and serious, and already behaved as if the ranch had been placed under his command. He barked at the broom, the firewood basket, and once at his own reflection in the stove door with such offended dignity that Grace laughed until her sides hurt. Blue, pale cream with gray shading along his back, was smaller but bolder in the foolish way of creatures who had survived too much too early. He chewed Noah's bootlaces, attacked dropped gloves, and fell asleep in the middle of crimes as though innocence were a legal defense. Their noise changed the house. Before them, Whittaker Ranch had sounded like wind, floorboards, and memory. Now it held squeaks, tiny growls, Grace's reluctant laughter, and Noah's low voice saying, "No, soldier, that is not food," to a puppy chewing a nail pouch. It should have felt foolish. Instead, it felt like someone had opened a window in a room long shut. Yet, Cedar Hollow was a town built with ears in the walls. By the time Grace drove in for more puppy formula and fencing staples, the story had already gone ahead of her, polished by boredom and sharpened by suspicion. Cedar Hollow sat 12 miles east, a narrow strip of weathered storefronts, a feed store, a diner with cracked red booths, a post office hardly bigger than a tool shed, and a church whose white steeple leaned slightly, like even faith got tired in hard winters. Grace parked her old blue pickup outside Harlan Feed and Supply and stepped down into slush. Inside, the bell over the door gave its familiar tired jingle. Leonard Harlan, the store owner, looked up from behind the counter. Leonard was a heavy-set man in his late 60s with a bald head polished by years under fluorescent lights, a white mustache thick enough to hide most of his mouth, and kind brown eyes that often lost battles against his curiosity. He had known Grace since she was a child buying peppermint sticks with pennies, but that morning his greeting came a half-beat late. 2 women by the seed packets stopped whispering. A ranch hand near the back pretended to examine buckets with the seriousness of a priest reading scripture. Grace felt the silence gather around her coat. She walked to the shelf, took 2 cans of puppy milk replacer, then added gloves, lamp oil, and a bag of starter feed she did not need just to give her hands something to do. "Road treating you all right, Grace?" Leonard asked, too casually. "Mud's honest," she said. "It tells you when it means to ruin your day." He chuckled, relieved to find humor still allowed. One of the women, Mrs. Pritchard, a narrow-faced widow with curled gray hair and a talent for making concern sound like accusation, leaned closer to her companion and whispered loudly enough for Mercy to die of embarrassment. Strange times. A woman alone taking in a man she doesn't know. Grace set the cans on the counter. Her cheeks warmed, but her voice stayed level. "Put it on my account, Leonard." He nodded, avoiding her eyes as he rang it up. The pity hurt worse than the gossip. Suspicion could be fought. Pity crawled under the ribs and made a person feel smaller than she was. Outside, Grace loaded the supplies into the pickup and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. For a moment, she saw herself as the town must have seen her. A woman, past 30, with no husband, no children, too much land, a stranger sleeping under her roof, and 2 orphaned pups as if she had started collecting lost things to prove she was not one of them. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened. She had buried both parents, kept the cattle fed, paid the taxes, survived frozen pipes, spring floods, and bank letters written with smiles made of ink. Yet, all it took was one man on her property for people to forget the woman who had been standing there all along. When she returned home, a familiar green pickup waited by the porch, old enough to complain and loyal enough to keep moving. Martha Doyle stood beside it, shaking snowmelt from a wool hat. Martha was 71, small and wiry, with copper-gray hair cut blunt at her chin, weather-browned skin, pale blue eyes sharp as January stars, and hands permanently rough from gardening, fence work, and slapping sense into stubborn neighbors when kindness failed. She had been Grace's nearest neighbor since Grace was 9, though nearest still meant 4 miles of rutted road and 1 creek crossing. Martha's husband had died of a heart attack 10 years earlier, leaving her with a sheep farm, a bad knee, and a habit of arriving exactly when people hoped she would not notice they needed help. "You look like the town chewed you and found gristle," Martha said. Grace climbed out, too tired to pretend. "Good to see you, too." Martha sniffed. "I brought bread, dewormer when those pups are old enough, and mail. Also, I heard nonsense in town and came to inspect it personally." Before Grace could answer, Ranger and Blue began squealing from inside like 2 badly tuned violins. Martha stepped into the kitchen, took one look at the puppies tumbling over Noah's socked foot near the stove, and folded her arms. Noah stood from the chair with military politeness. In daylight, with a healing scrape along one cheek and a clean flannel shirt borrowed from a box of Grace's father's old clothes, he looked less dangerous but no less formidable. "Ma'am," he said. Martha looked him up and down. "Former military?" "Yes." "Useful or decorative?" Grace nearly choked. Noah blinked once, then said, "Depends on the chore." Martha grunted, apparently satisfied, and crouched with surprising agility to inspect the pups. Blue tried to bite her sleeve. Ranger barked at her hat. "They've got spirit," she said. "Spirit is what polite people call trouble before it weighs 40 pounds. Then her expression shifted as she handed Grace a cream-colored envelope. "This came through my box by mistake, county office." Grace opened it at the table. The words inside seemed harmless at first, polite and official, but the meaning crawled out cold. A review had been requested regarding the Whitaker property, tied to an unresolved loan secured years ago by her father, Thomas Whitaker, and questions about continued management capacity. The request had been filed by Caleb Whitaker, a distant cousin on her father's side. Grace had not seen Caleb in almost 4 years, not since her mother's funeral, where he had worn a black suit too expensive for grief and spoken of land values while standing near the potato salad. Caleb was in his early 40s, tall and handsome in the polished way of men who never changed their own tires, with sandy blonde hair always combed neatly back, pale gray eyes, and a smile that arrived without warmth. He had inherited none of the ranching grit of the Whitaker name, only the appetite. He bought distressed properties, renamed them developments, and called it Vision. "He can't do this," Grace said, though the paper in her hand suggested otherwise. Martha's mouth tightened. "He can try." Noah took the letter only after Grace handed it to him. He read it once, then again, his eyes narrowing not with anger but calculation. "This isn't an eviction, it's pressure." "It's my father's debt," Grace said. "A small one. I've been paying it down." "Then we prove that. Records, receipts, tax statements, livestock counts, repair photos, anything showing you're maintaining the place." Grace looked at him. "We?" Noah glanced toward the crate where Blue had fallen asleep on top of Ranger like a pale cloud crushing a thunderstorm. "I'm already fixing your fence." It was not a vow. It was not romance. It was something steadier and, to Grace, more frightening. Someone choosing to stand close enough for trouble to see him, too. That evening, while the sun dropped behind the melting fields and the puppies slept beside the stove, Grace spread old folders across the kitchen table. Noah sat opposite her with his notebook. Martha claimed the chair nearest the coffee and announced she was there to make sure neither of them did anything noble and stupid without supervision. Outside, water dripped from the eaves like the last notes of winter's song. Inside, amid tax receipts, feed bills, repair logs, and two small dogs dreaming in the firelight, Grace understood that the storm at her door had only been the first one. The next would come dressed in paper, wearing a cousin's smile, and it would ask whether she had the right to keep the only home she had left. The thaw came slowly to Whitaker Ranch, not as mercy, but as mud, dripping eaves, and fields scarred open beneath the retreating snow. Grace Whitaker had always hated this part of winter most, the ugly in-between season when the world no longer looked pure but had not yet remembered how to grow. That week, her kitchen table disappeared beneath a battlefield of paper, feed bills, tax receipts, veterinary notes, loan statements, repair invoices, livestock records, old photographs of the barn, and newer photographs Noah had taken with her phone after patching the roof and straightening the lower fence. Grace moved through the documents with a tightness in her chest that no amount of coffee could loosen. She had faced frozen pipes, sick calves, broken machinery, and the long silence after funerals, but paper frightened her in a different way. A storm announced itself. A broken fence showed where it had failed. Paper smiled politely while it took things away. Noah Hayes seemed to understand that without needing her to say it. He sat across from her in one of her father's old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled to his forearms, his dark hair still damp from checking the pump house, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the evidence with the focused calm of a man assembling a mission map. He had a way of making chaos line up and confess its purpose. "Receipts by year," he said, sliding one stack to the left. "Repairs by structure. Loan payment records here, tax statements here. Anything with a date, keep visible. Anything with a signature, copy it." Grace watched his hands. Scarred knuckles, steady fingers, a faint white line along his thumb where some old injury had healed crooked. Those hands could break a man if they had to, she had no doubt. But now they moved carefully around her life, sorting it without claiming it, protecting without taking command. Near the stove, Ranger and Blue had been promoted from apple crate prisoners to supervised explorers. Ranger, still small but already solemn, sat on a folded towel like a miniature judge, black and tan ears beginning to lift unevenly from his head. Blue, pale and bold and morally untroubled, had stolen one of Noah's socks and was attempting to drag it under the cabinet as if smuggling treasure across enemy lines. "Your witness is tampering with evidence," Grace said. Noah glanced down. He has no remorse. Blue sneezed into the sock. For one bright second, Grace laughed, and the papers on the table seemed less like a noose. Then a vehicle sounded on the lane. Not Martha's rattling pickup, not the feed truck. This engine purred too smoothly, too confidently, stopping before the porch as if it already owned the ground beneath its tires. Grace stood before she meant to. Noah looked toward the door, the easy warmth leaving his face. He did not reach for a weapon. He only became still, and stillness on him felt like a warning written in stone. Through the window, Grace saw Caleb Whitaker step out into the cold afternoon. She recognized him at once, though 4 years had sharpened him. Caleb was in his early 40s, tall and narrow-waisted, with sandy blonde hair combed back neatly from a handsome face too smooth to have known much weather. His skin had the faint indoor tan of men who traveled between offices and country clubs, and his pale gray eyes carried a permanent calculation, always measuring value, weakness, leverage. He wore a dark wool coat, polished boots unsuited for mud, and leather gloves he removed slowly, as though every gesture deserved an audience. Beside him climbed a second man Grace did not know. He was shorter, perhaps mid-50s, with a compact body, thinning black hair brushed carefully over a high forehead, wire-rimmed glasses, and a mouth set in a narrow professional line. He carried a leather folder against his chest. This was Evan Mercer, Caleb's attorney from Helena, a man whose mild voice and tidy appearance made him seem harmless until one noticed how his eyes moved. Quick, dry, and exact, like a knife testing seams. Grace opened the door before they knocked. Cold air slid in around her boots. "Caleb," he smiled, and the smile arrived dressed as family but smelling of business. "Grace, you look well, considering." "Considering what?" His eyes flicked past her into the house, found Noah standing in the kitchen, then drifted to the puppies by the stove. "Considering how much you've taken on alone." Evan Mercer stepped forward with a polite nod. "Miss Whitaker, I'm here only to clarify the matter before the county review. We thought it best to speak informally first." "Funny," Grace said. "Informal usually doesn't come with a leather folder." Caleb's smile thinned. "May we come in? It's cold enough out here to make even stubborn people reasonable." Grace wanted to refuse. Every board in the porch seemed to hum with her father's voice, "Don't let a fox inspect the hen house." But refusing would become a story by evening, and Cedar Hollow already had enough stories with her name in them. She stepped aside. Caleb entered as if crossing a showroom. Mercer followed, wiping his shoes carefully before setting the folder on the kitchen table among her receipts. Noah remained near the counter, broad-shouldered and silent, not looming, not hiding. His presence bothered Caleb. Grace could see it in the small tightening near Caleb's eyes. "Mr. Hayes, I assume," Caleb said. "Noah," he replied. Nothing more. Caleb waited for a title, an explanation, some crack he could slip a finger into. Noah gave him none. Mercer opened the folder and removed several pages. His voice was soft, practiced, almost apologetic. "The issue concerns the outstanding secured note originally signed by Thomas Whitaker, along with questions regarding whether the property has been maintained according to the lender's conditions and county stewardship requirements. Mr. Whitaker has requested review because family interest may be affected if the estate becomes financially distressed." Grace stared at the page as if it were written in ice. "I've never missed a tax payment." "No one said you had," Caleb said gently. Too gently. "But taxes aren't the only measure of sustainability." "Don't dress greed as concern. It looks ridiculous on you." For the first time his smile cracked. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice into something almost tender, which made it worse. "Grace, your father was a proud man. Proud men make promises they can't afford. You've been keeping this place like a shrine, but shrines don't pay debts. Your mother wouldn't have wanted you to rot out here alone, chasing ghosts through broken fences." The words struck harder than she expected, not because they were true, but because they knew exactly where to hurt. Her throat tightened. For a moment, the kitchen blurred. Her mother's quilt in the puppy box, her father's mug by the sink, the faded height marks still carved into the pantry door from when Grace was 6, 9, 12. Caleb had never fixed a fence here. He had never held her mother's hand during the last fevered week in the hospital. He had never heard her father coughing in the barn because he refused to rest. Yet, here he stood, speaking as if grief were poor management. Noah shifted behind her, one step, no more. Grace felt it like a hand at her back, though he did not touch her. He would speak if she asked. He would stand between them if she broke. The knowledge steadied her enough to breathe. "This ranch is not a shrine," she said. Her voice came out low, but it came. "It is land, work, animals, debt, weather. It is mine because I stayed when everyone else found easier roads." Caleb's jaw tightened. Mercer glanced down, writing something. "No one questions your attachment," Mercer said. "The county will simply need proof of functional management." "Then the county can read," Grace replied, placing one hand on the stacks of receipts. "I have proof." Caleb looked at Noah again. "And him? Is he proof too, or liability?" The room changed. Even Ranger seemed to sense it, pushing himself up on unsteady paws and giving a small, ridiculous growl. Blue, still half wrapped around the stolen sock, blinked at the enemy without understanding politics but fully prepared for crime. Noah's face remained calm. I fix what she asks me to fix. For pay? Caleb asked. For shelter? No contract? Grace stepped between them before Noah answered. He is not the subject of this review. Caleb's eyes returned to her. Everything on this property may become subject to review. He collected his gloves. You should consider selling before the county makes this uglier than it needs to be. I can offer enough to clear the note and let you start fresh somewhere less. He looked around the kitchen, at the stove, the old cabinets, the puppies, Noah, and finally Grace. Burdened, Grace walked to the door and opened it. You're done. Caleb studied her for a long moment. No smile now, only the cold machinery beneath it. You always were Thomas's daughter. Best compliment you've given me. Mercer closed the folder, nodded stiffly, and followed Caleb out. Their vehicle rolled away through the mud, leaving twin black tracks along the lane like something dragged from the body of winter. That night, Grace held herself together until Martha's written statement was copied, the receipts were sorted, and the puppies were fed. Then, after midnight, when the house had gone quiet except for the stove and the soft breathing of Ranger and Blue, she sat on the back steps with her coat wrapped around her nightclothes and cried without sound. Noah found her there. He did not ask foolish questions. He sat beside her, leaving a careful distance. For a while they watched the stars tremble above the thawing fields. I lost 3 men on a ridge outside Kandahar, he said at last. His voice was rough, scraped from some buried room inside him. I made the call to move. Weather was closing. Intel was bad. I knew it felt wrong, but I moved us anyway. Ambush hit before extraction. I carried one of them half a mile. He died with his hand in my vest. Grace turned slowly. Noah looked older in the starlight, not by years, but by graves. After that, every place with a roof felt borrowed, like I had no right to sit down anywhere men better than me couldn't. Grace's tears cooled on her face. That's why you were holding Blue like that. He nodded once. Couldn't watch another small thing slip away. She looked toward the kitchen window, where the firelight glowed around the 2 sleeping puppies. I thought I was keeping this ranch alive for my parents, she said. Maybe I was just keeping grief fed. Noah did not offer comfort too quickly. That was one of the first things she trusted about him. Maybe, he said, or maybe grief was all you had until something else needed feeding. Grace laughed softly through the last of her tears. It was not a happy sound, but it was alive. In the morning they would face the county review. Caleb would bring polished words, Mercer would bring paper, and Cedar Hollow would bring every rumor it had sharpened over winter. But that night, on the cold steps of Whitaker Ranch, Grace understood that she and Noah were not so different. Both had mistaken loyalty to the dead for punishment of the living. Both had been standing guard over old losses, and inside the house, beside the stove, Ranger and Blue slept on, 2 tiny breaths tugging them, stubbornly and mercifully, back toward the present. The morning of the hearing came clear and cold, with a hard blue sky over Cedar Hollow and the last of the snow melting into brown mud along the ranch roads. Grace Whitaker stood before the narrow mirror in her bedroom, buttoning a dark wool coat she had not worn since her mother's funeral. It fit a little tighter at the shoulders than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown stronger in ways cloth could not forgive. Her chestnut hair was braided neatly down her back. Her face pale from a sleepless night, and her brown eyes held that strange, steady brightness people sometimes carried when fear had burned through them and left only resolve behind. Downstairs, Martha Doyle had arrived before sunrise in her old green pickup, bringing coffee, a pan of biscuits wrapped in a towel, and the commanding expression of a woman who believed nerves were best treated with butter. She took Ranger and Blue into her lap as if she had been appointed grandmother by a court older than law. Ranger, now round-bellied and black and tan with one ear beginning to lift in a crooked salute, protested at first, then settled against her boot with great seriousness. Blue, pale cream with gray along his spine and a talent for finding trouble in empty rooms, tried to chew the corner of Martha's sleeve until she told him he had the manners of a raccoon at a church supper. Noah Hayes waited by the truck outside, wearing a clean dark jacket over a flannel shirt, his beard trimmed close, his boots wiped free of mud, though the leather still bore scars from miles he had never explained. At 39, he carried himself like a man who had spent years obeying danger before learning how to live beside it. He did not tell Grace she would be fine. He knew better than to make promises the world had not signed. He only opened the passenger door of the old blue pickup and said, "We'll take it one question at a time." Grace nodded, clutching the thick folder of records against her chest as if it were both shield and anchor. The drive into Cedar Hollow felt longer than 12 miles. The thaw had left the road rutted and slick, and every turn seemed to pull another memory from the land. Her father teaching her to steer through mud, her mother laughing when a calf stuck its head through the laundry line, the first winter after they were gone when Grace had eaten canned soup for 3 nights because she could not bear to sit at the table alone. Noah drove carefully, both hands loose on the wheel, letting silence do the work that comfort often ruined. When they reached town, Grace noticed faces turning in windows, not openly cruel, not openly kind, only hungry for outcome. Cedar Hollow had always loved a story, especially one that allowed people to feel wise without being brave. The county office sat at the end of Main Street, a square brick building with a faded flag out front and muddy boot prints across the steps. Inside, the hallway smelled of wet wool, printer ink, and old coffee. The hearing room was not grand. There was no judge's bench, no polished drama, no thunderous gavel waiting to bless the righteous, just a long table, plastic chairs, fluorescent lights, and a framed map of the county that made every ranch look small enough to be moved with a thumb. At the head of the table sat Ruth Bell, the county review officer, a woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair cut in a sharp bob, medium brown skin weathered lightly at the cheeks, and dark eyes that seemed built for sorting truth from performance. She wore a navy blazer, no jewelry except a plain watch, and had the patient severity of someone who had spent decades listening to men explain why rules should bend only for them. Beside her sat Deputy Clerk Alan Pierce, a thin young man with sandy hair, nervous hands, and round glasses that slid down his nose whenever he looked at his laptop. Caleb Whitaker was already there, seated beside Evan Mercer. Caleb looked polished enough to make the room seem poorer. Camel-colored coat folded over his chair, sandy blonde hair combed back, pale gray eyes calm with practiced confidence. Evan Mercer, compact and tidy in a charcoal suit, arranged his papers with the expression of a man laying traps and calling them procedure. Grace sat opposite them. Noah took the chair beside her, not close enough to speak for her, but close enough that his presence steadied the air. Ruth Bell began without ceremony. "This is a county property management review concerning Whitaker Ranch. Parcel records under Grace Whitaker, with a secured loan originally held by Thomas Whitaker. Mr. Caleb Whitaker has requested review based on concerns of financial distress and management capacity. This is not an eviction proceeding. This office is here to determine whether further legal action is warranted." Her voice was dry, clear, and blessedly uninterested in gossip. Caleb leaned forward first, hands folded, grief painted faintly over his features like a rented suit. "Miss Bell, my concern is not personal. Grace and I are family, but Whitaker Ranch has been declining for years. She is alone out there with limited resources, and now there is an unrelated man residing on the property without a formal employment contract. I believe the estate is at risk, and I'm prepared to purchase or manage the property before debt or neglect destroys what my uncle built." Grace felt the old anger rise, hot under her ribs, but Noah's words from the morning returned, one question at a time. Evan Mercer added the colder version. He cited the outstanding loan balance, several years of minimal profit, photographs Caleb had taken from the county road showing leaning fence posts before Noah repaired them, and a statement from Mrs. Pritchard about unusual activity at the ranch. Grace nearly laughed at that. In Cedar Hollow, unusual activity could mean a man buying peaches in February. Ruth Bell took notes, then turned to Grace. "Miss Whitaker, You may respond." For a heartbeat, Grace's throat closed. The room watched her. Caleb watched her. The fluorescent lights buzzed as if even electricity had an opinion. She opened the folder and her hands trembled just enough for her to hate them. Then she saw, tucked between the papers, a photograph Noah had printed at the library that morning. The lower fence standing straight against the thawing field, the sunrise behind it, proof that something broken could be repaired. Grace breathed. "My father did leave alone," she said. "Mirror. He also left land, cattle, tools, and a daughter who knows how to use them." She placed the tax receipts first. Property taxes paid every year, then the feed bills, livestock maintained, then the hay contract, income from last summer, then repair invoices, pump receipts, veterinary notes, dated photographs of the barn roof, the porch, the water line, and the fence. Her voice grew steadier with each page. These were not just documents. They were winters survived, mornings endured, blisters earned, grief turned into labor. Martha Doyle came next as a witness, having driven in after feeding the pups. She entered with mud on her boots and righteousness in her spine, a small 71-year-old woman who made the room feel suddenly underdressed. "Grace has held that ranch together when most folks would have sold it for parts," Martha said. "I live 4 miles over. I've seen her pull calves in freezing rain, mend fence with a fever, and keep her accounts better than half the men who call themselves ranchers. If loneliness made a person unfit, this county would have to close every third farm." Alan Pierce coughed into his sleeve to hide a smile. Ruth Bell did not smile, but one eyebrow softened. Then Caleb turned his attention to Noah. "And what of Mr. Hayes? A former soldier appears during a storm and remains on the property. No contract, no background known to the county. How is that responsible management?" Ruth looked to Noah. "Mr. Hayes, please state your role." Noah stood, not dramatically, not like a hero rising before battle, but like a man who understood that truth did not need decoration. "My name is Noah Hayes. I served as a Navy SEAL for 15 years. I came onto Whitaker Ranch during the blizzard after my truck went off the road. I was carrying 2 orphaned German Shepherd pups I found near a wreck. Miss Whitaker provided shelter. Since then, I've stayed temporarily while my vehicle is being repaired, and I've helped with storm damage in exchange for room and board. I hold no claim to the land. I make no decisions about the ranch. Grace does." "So, she needs you," Caleb said, seizing the words like a fox grabbing a loose feather. Noah looked at him evenly. "Everyone needs help sometimes. That doesn't make them unfit. It makes them human." Caleb's mouth tightened. "Whitaker Ranch is standing today because you repaired it." Noah shook his head once. "No, it was standing when I arrived. I just fixed what the storm broke." Ruth Bell turned back to Grace. "Miss Whitaker, final statement." The room seemed to narrow to the table beneath her hands. Grace thought of her father's rough voice, her mother's quilt, Ranger's ridiculous growl, Blue fighting for breath, Noah sitting beside her under the stars admitting he did not feel worthy of a roof. She stood. "This ranch does not live because Caleb Whitaker signed a request. It does not live because people in town pity me, or because Noah showed up in a snowstorm. It lives because I get up every morning and do the work. I've paid what I could, repaired what broke, fed what depended on me, and stayed when leaving would have been easier. If the county needs paperwork, I brought paperwork. But don't mistake quiet for failure. Don't mistake a woman alone for a woman incapable." No one spoke. Even Caleb seemed for once unable to find a clean place for his knife. Ruth Bell reviewed the documents for several long minutes, asked Alan to confirm payment records, then folded her hands. "Based on the evidence provided, this office does not find grounds to recommend removal of management or emergency intervention. Miss Whitaker remains the recognized operator of Whitaker Ranch. The outstanding loan documentation must be updated within 60 days and repayment terms clarified with the lender. Mr. Whitaker's request for further county action is denied at this time." The words entered Grace slowly, like warmth returning to numb fingers. Not a miracle. Not complete freedom. 60 days still stood ahead like a hard road, but the land remained hers. Her name remained on the record. Her voice had not disappeared beneath Caleb's. Outside, on the county office steps, the sky was almost painfully bright. Grace made it halfway to the truck before the folder slipped against her chest and the tears came. She tried to stop them, embarrassed by their timing, but Noah only stood beside her, blocking the wind with his body, saying nothing. Martha reached them a moment later and put one small, rough hand on Grace's shoulder. For the first time in years, Grace did not cry because something had been taken. She cried because, at last, someone had listened. The first true wind of spring came dry across the Montana fields, carrying the smell of thawed mud, old grass, and something restless that did not belong to peace. Grace Whitaker felt it before she understood it. The day after the hearing should have given the ranch a softer silence, the kind that settled after a hard victory. But Whitaker Ranch seemed to hold its breath beneath the darkening sky. The snow had retreated to thin white patches along the fence lines, leaving the yard slick with mud and the lower pasture bruised brown beneath the moon. Inside the house, the stove burned low. Ranger and Blue slept near the hearth with bellies full, and Noah Hayes sat at the kitchen table cleaning a hinge he had removed from the back door. He had been quieter since the hearing, not distant exactly, but watchful in a way Grace was beginning to recognize. Peace made him listen harder. Calm to Noah was never empty. It was a room where danger might be hiding behind the curtains. Grace stood at the sink washing 2 cups, watching his reflection in the dark window. His broad shoulders were bent over the work, his jaw shadowed by evening stubble, his gray-blue eyes lowered but not relaxed. A man could leave war, she thought, but war did not always have the manners to leave him. Then Ranger growled. It was not his usual brave little nonsense at brooms or bootlaces. The black and tan German Shepherd pup was nearly 10 weeks old now. Still small, still clumsy, but his body had lengthened, his ears beginning to rise with uneven dignity. He stood stiff-legged near the mudroom door, nose lifted, a low sound trembling in his chest. Blue woke beside him, pale cream and gray, one paw still caught in the corner of the towel he had been chewing. For once, Blue did not turn the moment into comedy. He stared toward the darkness and barked, sharp and frightened. Noah rose before Grace could dry her hands. He did not rush. That was what scared her. He moved with controlled speed, turning off the kitchen lamp, then crossing to the window beside the pantry. "Stay away from the glass," he said. Grace's mouth went dry. "What is it?" Noah tilted his head, listening past the dogs, past the wind, past the old house settling on its bones. "Engine. Maybe 2. Grace reached for her phone on the counter. One bar appeared, vanished, then returned like a candle in a storm. Far beyond the barn, a pair of headlights rolled briefly across the line of cottonwoods, then went black. The night swallowed them, but Noah had already seen enough. "Call Briggs," he said. Sheriff Daniel Briggs was Cedar Hollow's lawman, a broad, heavy-built man in his early 50s with a thick salt-and-pepper beard, deep-set hazel eyes, and a face made stern by weather rather than cruelty. He had once been a volunteer firefighter before taking the badge, and people trusted him because he spoke slowly, drove fast when it mattered, and never used authority to make himself taller. Grace had known him since childhood, though mostly through traffic warnings, church fundraisers, and the day he had stood hat in hand at her father's funeral. Her call connected, broke apart, then connected again. "Sheriff, Grace Whitaker, someone's on the property, near the barn." Static chewed through the line. She heard only pieces of his answer. "Stay inside. Deputies. On my way." Then the call died. Noah looked toward the mudroom where his coat hung. "Lock the back door. Take the pups to the pantry." "No." The word came out before fear could soften it. "Grace." "Don't talk to me like I'm a package you can put on a shelf." His eyes met hers then, and for a flash she saw the battle inside him. Protect her by commanding, or trust her by standing beside her. He swallowed the first instinct. Then stay behind me, and if I tell you to move, move. Outside, a door slammed in the distance. Men's voices drifted over the wet fields, low and careless, carrying the sour confidence of people who believed darkness had signed their permission slip. Near the barn, a flashlight winked on, then another. Grace saw two figures moving between the feed shed and hay storage. One was tall and gaunt, with a long neck, narrow shoulders, and a dirty denim jacket hanging loose from his frame. His name, though Grace did not know it yet, was Wade Kruger, a local drifter in his 30s with straw-colored hair, hollow cheeks, and the jittery energy of a man who had spent years blaming bad luck for choices he kept repeating. The other was shorter and heavier, a thick-chested man with a shaved head, a reddish beard, and hands like fence posts. This was Roy Maddox, once a mechanic in Cedar Hollow before drink and debt turned him mean. Roy walked with the swagger of someone who mistook cruelty for courage, carrying a metal crowbar at his side. Noah opened the mudroom door, and cold air swept across the floor. Ranger and Blue bolted before Grace could catch them. "No!" she hissed, but the pups shot into the yard, barking with all the ferocity their young bodies could afford. The intruders cursed. A glass bottle flashed in Wade's hand, a rag stuffed into its neck, flame licking at the cloth. It had likely been meant for the hay storage, a warning fire, a terror message written in smoke. But Blue darted toward him, barking wildly, and Wade stumbled backward in panic. The bottle slipped, hit the barn threshold, and burst. Fire crawled up the dry straw scattered near the doorway, then caught the weathered boards with hungry speed. Grace's breath vanished. The barn, her father's barn, lit from below in orange teeth. "Ranger! Blue!" She ran. Noah cursed and followed, grabbing a wool blanket from the mudroom bucket where Grace kept old rags for muddy boots. Smoke thickened fast, blown by the spring wind through gaps in the boards. Ranger came out first, coughing, his small black and tan body streaked with soot, but he refused to retreat. He spun back toward the doorway, barking with desperate fury. Blue was inside. Grace plunged toward the entrance before thought could become fear. Heat struck her face. The air in the barn had turned bitter, full of smoke and sparks. Somewhere inside, Blue cried high and thin, a sound so small it seemed impossible the whole burning world did not stop to answer. Grace dropped to her knees, crawling beneath the worst of the smoke. She saw him near a fallen plank beside the feed bins, trapped more by terror than weight, his pale fur darkened with ash. Noah came through the smoke behind her, blanket raised against the flames. "Grace, low!" he shouted. She reached Blue, coughing hard, fingers closing around his trembling body. At the doorway, Roy Maddox lunged from the side, crowbar swinging at Noah's shoulder. Noah turned just in time. The blow glanced off the blanket-wrapped arm, hard enough to stagger him. For one terrible second, Grace saw the man Noah used to be rise behind his eyes. Precise, lethal, cold as mountain steel. Roy backed up, suddenly less certain. Wade ran toward the truck. Noah could have gone after them. He could have ended the threat with the brutal efficiency carved into him by 15 years of war. Instead, he looked at Grace on the barn floor with Blue clutched to her chest, and the old world inside him lost. He chose this one. Noah shoved Roy backward, not to punish, only to clear a path, then lifted Grace by the arm and pulled her out through smoke and sparks. They stumbled into the yard as a section of the barn wall groaned behind them. Ranger leapt against Grace's leg, whining. Blue coughed weakly in her arms, alive but shaking. Noah soaked the blanket in the stock tank and beat at the smaller flames along the threshold, buying time more than winning. Red and blue lights appeared on the lane minutes later, cutting through smoke and darkness like judgment with a siren. Sheriff Briggs arrived in his county SUV, followed by 2 volunteer fire trucks and Martha Doyle's green pickup fishtailing behind them like an angry beetle. Martha, small and fierce beneath a wool cap, climbed out before the engine stopped, her copper-gray hair flying loose, shouting Grace's name with all the tenderness of a threat. Briggs stepped into the yard with a shotgun held low, his beard silvered by flashing lights. "Hands where I can see them!" he roared. Wade froze near the truck. Roy, still on his knees in the mud where Noah had shoved him, dropped the crowbar as if it had turned venomous. The volunteer firefighters moved quickly, dragging hoses, shouting over one another, their helmets catching firelight. Water hit the flames with a violent hiss. Steam rolled over the yard. The barn did not fall, but one side was badly charred, black ribs showing where boards had burned through. Grace stood barefoot in the mud without realizing she had lost a boot. She held Blue inside her coat while Ranger pressed against her ankle, trembling with delayed fear. Noah stood a few feet away, breathing hard. Soot streaked across his face, one sleeve torn, his right shoulder already stiffening where the crowbar had struck. Briggs cuffed Wade first. Roy cursed until Briggs leaned close and said something too low for Grace to hear, after which Roy became suddenly religious about silence. But Wade broke quickly. Fear made him younger, thinner, smaller. "It wasn't supposed to go like that," he stammered. "Just scare her." Caleb said, "Just scare her, make her sell, that's all." The name fell into the smoking yard like another match. Grace closed her eyes. She was too tired to be surprised. Martha came to her side and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Noah turned at the sound of Caleb's name, but he did not move toward Wade. He did not chase vengeance into the dark. He looked at Grace instead. That was when she understood the choice he had made in the barn had not ended at the doorway. It was still happening. He was still choosing. Dawn came slowly, gray and pink through the last ribbons of smoke. The firefighters soaked the blackened boards. Briggs loaded the two men into separate vehicles and promised Grace they would talk after she had been checked for smoke inhalation. Martha fussed over the puppies, calling them heroic idiots. Ranger accepted this with solemn pride. Blue slept against Grace's chest, exhausted but breathing. Noah stood beside the charred barn, staring at the damage as if measuring not wood, but the distance between the man he had been and the man he had become. Grace walked to him through the mud. For a moment, neither spoke. The air smelled of ash, wet earth, and the first wounded breath of spring. "You could have gone after them," she said. Noah looked at the barn, then at Blue in her arms, then at Ranger leaning against his boot. "I know." "Why didn't you?" His face softened, tired and bare in the morning light. "Because what needed saving was behind me." Grace reached for his hand. His fingers were cold, bruised, and hesitant for only a heartbeat before they closed around hers. The barn was burned. The night had left scars, and Caleb's shadow still stretched somewhere beyond the hills. But Grace felt Noah's hand remain in hers, and this time he did not pull away. In the mud and ash of Whitaker Ranch, with two soot-streaked puppies alive between them, they both understood the truth the fire had revealed. They were no longer just defending land. They had become the reason each other kept standing. Spring did not burst across Montana. It returned carefully, like a wounded animal learning to trust an open hand. A few weeks after the fire, the last snow withdrew from the slopes beyond Whitaker Ranch, leaving dark soil, wet grass, and thin green shoots pushing up beside the fence posts. The burned side of the barn still stood black against the morning, a charred reminder of what greed had tried to take, but it no longer looked like defeat. It looked like a scar, and Grace Whitaker knew scars were not proof that something had ended. Sometimes they were proof that something had refused to die. She stood in the yard with her sleeves rolled up, her chestnut hair tied beneath a faded blue bandana, her face touched by sun for the first time in months. At 32, Grace still carried the same lean strength and quiet watchfulness, but the tight loneliness around her eyes had begun to loosen. She was still the woman who could mend wire, haul feed, argue with a bank officer, and stare down a man like Caleb Whitaker without blinking, yet now she no longer moved as though every burden had to be carried in secret. Around her, the ranch breathed in a new rhythm. Hammers striking fresh boards, boots sinking in mud, dogs barking at absolutely nothing with the confidence of prophets. Cedar Hollow had changed its voice after the fire. People who had whispered now arrived with supplies, casseroles, apologies, and faces red from shame or wind. Leonard Harlan came in his feed store cap, carrying nails and 2 sacks of puppy food, his white mustache twitching as he told Grace he should have spoken kinder sooner. Mrs. Pritchard arrived with a lemon cake wrapped in foil and the stiff expression of a woman trying to repent without bending her neck too far. Grace accepted both the cake and the apology, though Blue later stole one corner of the foil and wore it on his head like a tiny bishop, which Noah claimed was the closest the dog would ever come to holiness. Even Martha Doyle laughed at that, and Martha did not give laughter away cheaply. Caleb Whitaker's name moved through town differently now. Wade Kruger's confession had reached Sheriff Daniel Briggs, and Briggs had done what Briggs always did: slowly, thoroughly, and without caring whose family name sat on the paperwork. Caleb was under investigation for hiring Wade and Roy to frighten Grace into selling. His attorney had stopped calling. His polished confidence, once sharp as a knife, had dulled under the weight of witness statements, phone records, and the inconvenient fact that criminals were rarely loyal when handcuffs appeared. Grace did not celebrate his downfall. Not exactly. She only felt a heavy door inside her close. Caleb had wanted the ranch because he saw value in the land. Grace wanted it because her father's boots had worn paths through the mud, because her mother's quilts still warmed the beds, because 2 newborn pups had been saved beside the stove, because Noah Hayes had stood in the yard after the fire and chosen what needed saving over what deserved punishment. That was the difference between owning something and belonging to it. Noah stayed. At first, no one said the word aloud, because some truths were shy and needed time to settle. He stayed through the first week of rebuilding, then the second. He framed the burned wall, replaced beams, reinforced the roof, and planted a row of young cottonwoods along the drive to slow the winter wind in years to come. He worked with the same disciplined precision Grace had noticed from the beginning, but there was less iron in him now, less of the man who expected danger in every quiet. His shoulders still tensed at sudden noises. Some nights the old war still crossed his face like a cloud passing over the moon, but he no longer looked as if he were apologizing for taking up space beneath a roof. Ranger and Blue made sure no man could remain too solemn for long. Ranger, black and tan and growing into his paws, had appointed himself guardian of the new barn. He sat near the doorway with one ear up and one ear undecided, watching every hammer swing as if inspecting the work for structural sins. Blue, pale cream with gray along his back, had become the ranch thief, dragging gloves, rags, and once Martha's gardening hat beneath the porch. Noah found his missing work glove in the water trough one morning, floating there like a tiny drowned accusation. "Blue," he said, holding it up. The pup sneezed and looked proud. Grace laughed so hard she had to sit on an overturned bucket, and Noah, watching her, smiled with a tenderness that made the spring light seem to pause. Grace changed too, though slowly enough that she noticed it only in ordinary things. She began setting 2 mugs beside the coffee pot without thinking. She stopped apologizing when someone helped her carry lumber. She let Leonard deliver feed instead of insisting she could make the trip herself. She allowed Martha to sit at her kitchen table and fuss over the puppies while pretending not to fuss over Grace. The house, once a museum of grief, became inconveniently alive. There were muddy boots by the door, Noah's notebook beside the salt shaker, puppy paw prints on the clean floor, fresh lumber receipts stacked beside old family photographs. At night, Grace and Noah sat on the porch after chores, not speaking much, watching the sky turn violet over the fields. Their silence had changed. Once it had been a wall. Now it was a blanket large enough for 2. One morning near the end of April, Eli Turner finished repairing Noah's truck. Eli was Cedar Hollow's mechanic, a wiry man in his mid-40s with oil permanently darkening the lines of his hands, sandy hair flattened under a grease-stained cap, and a crooked grin that made every diagnosis sound like gossip. He drove the pickup back to the ranch himself, climbed out, slapped the hood, and announced, "She'll run, provided nobody asks her to have ambition." Noah thanked him, paid the bill, and stood for a long time beside the truck after Eli left. The road beyond the gate was dry now. The county issue was under control. Caleb's threat had collapsed into police files and lawyer silence. Grace no longer needed Noah to shovel snow, fix storm damage, or stand behind her against men who mistook loneliness for weakness. He was free to go. Grace understood that, and because she understood it, she did not ask him to stay. Love, she had learned, could not be built from a locked door. Noah packed the next morning. Not much: an old duffel, a few folded shirts, a worn photograph tucked into a side pocket, the battered notebook where he had once written feeding times for 2 dying pups. Grace watched from the porch with Ranger pressed against her leg. Blue raced in circles through the yard with one of Noah's old gloves clenched in his mouth, unaware that comedy was sometimes the only thing keeping hearts from breaking cleanly in two. Noah set the duffel in the bed of the repaired truck. He looked down the road, toward Cedar Hollow, toward highways, toward whatever life a man could still find if he kept moving. Then he turned back. The house stood warm in the morning sun. Grace stood in the open doorway, not crying, not pleading, only present. Ranger sat like a young sentinel at her boot. Blue dropped the glove and barked once as if casting a vote. Noah's hand rested on the truck bed. A long silence passed through him, and in that silence he saw the storm, the fire. Blue's faint breath against his chest, Grace's voice in the county office, her hand closing around his in the ash. Slowly, he lifted the duffel out of the truck. Grace's eyes softened, but she did not move. "Forget something?" she asked. Noah looked at the road one last time, then at her. "Yeah," he said. "I forgot I don't want to leave anymore." By afternoon, Noah was at the front gate with a hammer, repairing the old wooden sign her father had carved years ago. Whitaker Ranch. The letters were weathered, but still strong. Grace stood beside him, holding a small board he had sanded smooth. He had painted the words himself in plain black letters. Home of Ranger and Blue. "You know this will go straight to their heads," Grace said. "Too late," Noah answered. "Ranger already thinks he owns the barn." Blue chose that moment to trip over his own feet and roll down the small ditch beside the gate, proving that destiny had a sense of humor. Noah drove the final nail. The sound rang clear in the spring air. Grace looked at the sign, then at the rebuilt barn, the greening fields, the 2 dogs tumbling through sunlight, and the man beside her who had arrived as a stranger carrying 2 fragile lives through snow. She reached for his hand. This time, neither of them hesitated. No vows were spoken. No church bells rang. The miracle was quieter than that. It was a door left open, a truck not taken, a hand held in daylight. Grace Whitaker was no longer guarding memory alone. Noah Hayes was no longer running from ghosts. And across the young grass of Whitaker Ranch, Ranger and Blue barked into the wind as if announcing to all of Montana that winter had lost, love had stayed, and home had learned how to breathe again. In the end, the story of Grace, Noah, Ranger, and Blue reminds us that God's miracles do not always arrive with thunder in the sky or angels at the door. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in a wet blanket during a snowstorm, carried by a stranger who has almost forgotten how to hope. Sometimes a miracle is a second chance, a hand that stays, a small life that keeps breathing when everyone fears it will not, or a home that begins to heal after years of silence. In our daily lives, we may not always recognize God's work at first. It may look like trouble, loss, delay, or an unexpected knock when our hearts are tired. But grace often enters through the very door we are afraid to open. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little light today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what part moved you most. And if you believe in stories of hope, healing, animals, and second chances, please subscribe to our channel. May God bless you and your loved ones, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and remind you that even after the coldest winter, love can still find its way back.